The gentleman from Washington seek recognition.
Mr. Speaker, pursuant to House Resolution 252, I call up House Resolution 124 and ask for its immediate consideration.
The clerk will report the title of the resolution.
House Resolution 124, resolution expressing opposition to banning service in the armed forces by openly transgender individuals.
Pursuant to House Resolution 252, the resolution is considered read. The resolution shall be debatable for 1 hour, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Armed Services. The gentleman from Washington, Mr. Smith, and the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Thornberry, each will control 30 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Washington, Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and to include extraneous material on House Res 124.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself 5 minutes.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. This resolution is very straightforward. The Department of Defense, in cooperation with the White House, recently issued a policy which will be implemented in a couple of weeks that would effectively bar transgender people from being able to serve in the military. We have this resolution to reject that policy. It's that simple and that straightforward. We believe that the policy that the Pentagon is putting forward is unfair and based on ignorance and bigotry and will actually harm national security. And we ask the House in this resolution to express the sense of Congress that we oppose this policy from the Pentagon. Again, what this policy is primarily based on is ignorance and bias against the transgender community. The policy is being implemented that will make it virtually impossible for them to serve in the military. This is unfair discrimination, and it is also harmful to national security. The Army last year failed to meet its recruitment quotas, and it is a constant challenge in the military to find the people who have the character, the capability, and the ability to serve in our military. We have the best military in the history of the world. We need high qualified people to serve, and to single out a particular group of people, to discriminate against them and say that they cannot serve, not because they can't meet the qualifications. It's not because they can't run fast enough or shoot straight enough or work hard enough to be a member of the military, but because of something that literally has nothing to do with their ability to do their job, is bad for national security and unfair discrimination. Now, we have heard a lot from people about how difficult it is for unit cohesion to have transgender people in the military, whole bunch of arguments. The only problem with that is the military leaders who have actually been responsible for this, and I'm just going to read one quote, there are many, and some of my colleagues will say it as well, but Army Chief of Staff Milley, who is about to become the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, said last year there are precisely 0 reports of issues of cohesion, discipline, or morale as a result of transgender people serving. So there is no issue in terms of readiness, despite what the proponents of this policy will say. It is discrimination, pure and simple, and it is unnecessary. Now, you also hear opponents say that, well, the policy doesn't ban transgender people from serving. Under certain circumstances, they can. But those circumstances, as described, are so limiting and restricting. And worst of all, as I'll explain in a minute, in certain parts, it allows them to serve only if they are willing to deny who they are. And that amounts to a ban. If you cannot be who you are and serve in the military, then that is a choice that nobody should have to make. And let's start with the fact that right now, under this policy, anyone who wants to join the military, if they have transitioned to a different gender, either gone through the surgery or began hormone therapy, this policy says you cannot join. Now, again, this doesn't say anything about their fitness to serve in terms of their physical ability or anything. If you have simply had transition surgery or gone through hormone therapy, you are barred from serving. But worse than that, the people who are already in the military, who are transgender, who to a certain extent are grandfathered in many different places throughout this policy, it says over and over again that they have to serve in their biological sex. Now, a lot of people go, well, what the heck does that mean? But that gets at the essence, at the very heart of what it means to be transgender. And this is not something that is just in people's minds. It is a physiological condition that people are born into, in which they decide they are more comfortable being in the opposite gender. And that's one of the cornerstone difficulties that all of these people have to go through is, who am I? What gender do I want to be? And working with therapists, working with other people, they make that determination. They decide, I know who I am, and this is who I'm going to be. This policy now says, sorry, we don't care what your doctor says. You cannot be the gender that you know that you are. You have to deny who you are in order to stay in the military. In many places throughout this policy, that is a consistent theme and points out what is so totally and completely wrong about this policy. Now, you've also heard undoubtedly that there are higher healthcare costs for people who are transgender. There are a number of studies out that show that that actually isn't true. Yes, healthcare expense is part of people who serve in the military, and regrettably, people who join the military have all manner of different healthcare expenses, which we do have to pick up. But there is no evidence that this has an increased cost over your average service member. And furthermore, we know that the purpose of this policy is not about cost, because of one of the first points that I made about how you are not now going to be allowed to join the military, even if you have already gone through transition therapy, transition surgery, or hormone therapy. So even if you're all done with that, and there is no additional medical cost to come, this policy says you are barred and banned from joining the military. Give myself an additional 15 seconds.
Gentleman is recognized.
Makes it perfectly clear that this policy is unfair discrimination based on bigotry and ignorance, and I urge this House to reject it. I reserve the balance of my time.
Reserves. The gentleman from Washington is recognized. From Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, this resolution is a sense of Congress resolution that makes no change whatsoever in law or policy. It's a messaging bill rather than legislation that actually does something on a substantive issue. So one may ask, well, why bother opposing a bill that doesn't do anything? Well, I've got a couple of answers. Part of the answer to me is that we normally do not bring isolated issues in the jurisdiction of the Armed Services Committee to the floor. Because part of the reason that a National Defense Authorization Bill has been signed into law every year for 58 straight years under presidents of both parties and Congresses of both parties is that we try to look at national security as a whole as it relates to the Department of Defense. So there have been a few isolated instances where something needed immediate attention, but generally we try to look at the whole, not bring isolated issues to the floor. I worry that doing so, even with a messaging bill, undermines that bipartisan approach that has been so successful. Another part of the reason, Mr. Speaker, is that we also normally try to keep our troops above and beyond politics. And so bringing a messaging bill that does nothing to law or policy also threatens to undermine that, and I worry about that. On its face, the resolution, the messaging bill that's before us, includes a number of statements that are just flat wrong. It says that President Trump reversed the prior policy on transgender individuals in a tweet. But in fact, well before any presidential tweet, Secretary of Defense Mattis had put a delay on implementation of the policy that had previously been announced so that there could be a 6-month review. And there was a 6-month review with experts, with uniformed civilian people from all the services, with medical experts, a whole variety of folks. And it is serious and thoughtful. Despite some of the characterizations that have been made from time to time, I recommend that members actually read it. Because I think they will be impressed. They may not agree with all of the recommendations, but they'll see the serious and thoughtful approach that the department took to this issue. And as a result of this review, the previous policy was modified. It didn't go back to the way it was, but again, those details are in the report. The resolution before us today says that the Mattis policy is a ban. It's not. And the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals found on January 4th, 2019, that it is factually inaccurate to call it a blanket ban. In reversing the lower court, the Court of Appeals said, quote, "The district court made an erroneous finding that the Mattis plan was the equivalent of a blanket ban on transgender service," end quote. This resolution before us says that there is a global medical consensus on transgender care. But the World Professional Association for Transgender Health says that they offer flexible clinical guidelines which cannot possibly reflect all the differences and situations which exist. Mr. Speaker, just turning to the substance of the matter for a second, to me, the heart of the issue is contained in the very first sentence to the department report, which was issued February 2018. The first sentence says, "It is a bedrock principle of the Department of Defense that any eligible individual who can meet the high standards for military service without special accommodations should be permitted to serve." Any eligible individual who can meet the standards without special accommodation should be permitted to serve. That's what I believe, Mr. Speaker. I think that's what this policy attempts to achieve. Now, it is a fair question or a point to say, well, it went too far this way. It didn't go far enough this way. We can have those substantive, serious debates in an appropriate time and place. But a messaging bill is not going to get that job done. I would say finally, Mr. Speaker, that our committee heard day before yesterday a reminder that only 29% of Americans aged 17 to 25 are eligible for military service. Only 29% meet the physical, mental, and legal requirements to be eligible for military service, even if they want to. Now, that means 71% are not eligible for whatever reason. Now, there can be, and maybe there should be, a debate that the standards are too high, that we need to lower the standards. We need to make some changes in the standards so that more people are eligible. But the point is, our view of military service is that anyone who meets those standards should be allowed to serve. If someone cannot meet those standards for whatever reason, no fault of their own, then they are not able to serve. They can serve in a different way, but not in military service. I think, again, Mr. Speaker, if we were to really be discussing the substance of the issue rather than a messaging bill, then we could talk about the high standards for military service without special accommodation, and there would be a substantive discussion. That's not what we're doing today. It's a messaging bill, and that's too bad because there are serious issues that need to be discussed. I would reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just briefly, I will agree, this is a messaging bill. And the message is this is a bad policy. That is what the House is doing. I will also agree that when it comes to crafting the right policy in this area, it should be done in committee, and it will be done in committee. That's why we didn't bring that out here on the floor. But I think it is important for the House of Representatives to make it clear how wrong we think this policy is. And with that, I am pleased to yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Kennedy.
Gentleman is recognized for 3 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, equal has always been our nation's North Star. Endowed by our Creator, inscribed by Jefferson in our Declaration of Independence, engraved above the doors to the highest court in our land, codified in our Constitution after a war tore our country apart. It is that pursuit of equality, that journey for a more perfect union, that sets America apart. At times, we have stumbled. We have enslaved men, women, and children because of the color of their skin. We have segregated those same families in the first breath of their freedom. We have stigmatized fellow Americans based on their race, their ancestry, their God, the nation of their birth, the hand that they hold, and their very identity. Some, willing to die for our freedom, fought wars only to meet a government that offered them a handshake and a return to second-class citizenship. Today, this House has a chance to not repeat the mistakes of our past, to move one step closer to that sacred promise by telling brave trans men and women in uniform that they cannot be banned from military service because of who they are. Because that is the very foundation for this policy. Targeted discrimination against transgender Americans. Supporters will say otherwise. It's about unit cohesion, they say. Except for the fact that the 5 chiefs of staff for the military branches have testified that they're aware of exactly 0 instances of a transgender service member negatively impacting discipline or morale. It will degrade our military, they say. Except that 56 retired generals and flag officers told us that it is the ban that would degrade readiness, quote, even more than the failed don't ask, don't tell policy did. It's science, they say. Except that the Department of Defense relied on data nearly half a century old and ignored plenty of other studies. Just ask the American Medical Association, the American Psychology Association, the American Psychiatric Association. It's about cost, they say. Except that the military spends 10 times more annually on erectile dysfunction medication than we have on trans-related care in the last 3 years combined. It's not a ban, they say. Ask
Gentleman's
anyone
time has
of the
expired.
brave transgender service members or
I
veterans
yield the gentleman an additional 1 minute.
in the gallery today to ask exactly what this ban means. Mr. Speaker, in a country that celebrates freedom, this policy tells our service members that they do not have the freedom to be who they are. Where is the freedom in that? I ask all members of the House to support this resolution. I yield back to you.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Washington, Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I yield 5 minutes to the gentlelady from Missouri, Ms. Hartzler.
Gentlewoman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Let me tell you about a sharp young patriot from my district. She worked hard, earned straight A's, and was accepted into law school to join the JAG Corps. She, however, was denied entry into the military because she had bunions on her feet. She is an amazing woman and a long-distance runner, but DOD's policy was clear that due to the risk of future surgery, she could potentially be temporarily undeployable and so was denied entrance into military service. She did not meet the physical, mental, medical standards. Another constituent was denied service because he had asthma. He too wanted to serve his country, but the health risks outweighed the benefits to the military. He did not meet the physical, mental, medical standards. DOD's military accession standards state individuals must be free of medical conditions or physical defects that may require excessive time lost from duty for necessary treatment or hospitalization. Our all-voluntary military is the greatest military force in the world, and we must allow it to make the best medical and military judgment about what medical conditions should qualify or disqualify an individual from serving. We should not carve out exceptions for an entire population. Military service is a privilege, not a right. That is why Secretary Mattis reviewed and issued a new policy on transgender service and the medical condition of gender dysphoria. The policy is not a ban, and it allows transgender service members to serve in their biological sex. The Mattis policy does not kick anyone out of the military for being transgender, nor does it give preferential treatment to transgender persons. All persons, unless grandfathered or granted a waiver, must serve in their birth gender. It is a fair policy, allowing transgender individuals to serve openly as long as they're willing to serve in the biological sex and they can meet the medical behavioral standards. This resolution we're voting on today is riddled with inaccuracies. First, as I just stated, the policy is not a ban. Second, it claims there's a global medical consensus that transgender care is effective, safe, and reliable. That is not true. RAND, the Mayo Clinic, CMS, and others have all determined that there is not enough quality evidence to be able to say that. And there are valid concerns. There are costs as well. The Department of Defense announced already that they have spent $8 million on those individuals who have identified as transgender last year, and that money has been spent on psychotherapy, on sex change operations, and that's money that could have been spent on bullets, body armors for our troops. And third, the resolution claims there's not an adverse effect on military readiness. This is false. The individual readiness of those undergoing treatment for gender dysphoria will be impacted. It takes over 260 days just to recover from the surgery. Individual readiness directly impacts the readiness of their forces. So the diagnosis and treatment for transgender personnel takes them away from their jobs for an indeterminate amount of time. This lost deployment time means someone else will have to step forward and go in their place. This is unfair. The military has valid reasons for excluding people with certain medical conditions from service. It is not the job of Congress to dictate what medical conditions the military should accept. We should not degrade the efficiency and lethality of our armed forces. This resolution is riddled with false claims, and I urge my colleagues to oppose its passage, and I yield back.
The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to yield 1 minute to the Speaker of the House, Ms. Pelosi.
The Speaker is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the distinguished chairman for yielding time and really for his leadership on this very important issue as to who we are as a nation, how we honor our oath to protect and defend the American people, and doing so recognizing the contribution of all who want to serve our country. I want to thank you, Mr. Adam Smith, for your leadership. I also want to acknowledge the leadership of our colleague Joe Kennedy, sponsor of this legislation, for his relentless leadership, his forming and chairmanship of the Transgender Caucus that has been so important in making clear in our policy that we respect the dignity and worth of every person. Mr. Speaker, the men and women who step forward to serve in the U.S. military are patriots, all of them, people of great strength and courage whose sacrifice keeps us safe. We owe those heroes our most humble gratitude and our most steadfast support. And I want to thank our trans friends for their service, their courage, their patriotism in serving our country. Thank you. Instead of honoring their service, the president continues to insist on his cruel transgender service member ban. This is an act of cruelty. Let us all salute again Congressman Joe Kennedy, a champion for equality, fairness, and dignity in this Congress, for his firm moral leadership on this resolution to oppose the president's bigoted ban. This resolution is the resolution that our distinguished chairman, Mr. Smith, and our colleague Joe Kennedy are putting forth is bipartisan, because protecting transgender service members is a matter of patriotism, and it transcends politics. The president's ban, as I said, is cruel and arbitrary, a decision designed to humiliate the transgender Americans who are risking and giving their lives for the United States of America. There is no moral justification for this ban, which violates every value of our American democracy and betrays our fundamental belief in fairness, dignity, and respect. There is no medical justification for this ban, which the American Medical Association, the American Psychological Association, and the American Psychiatric Association all oppose. And there's no military justification for this ban, which would undermine our military readiness and make America less strong and safe, and that is according to our own military. After the president first unleashed his ban, 56 retired generals and flag officers issued a statement asserting that the ban would cause significant, these are their words, quote, would cause significant disruptions, deprive the military of mission-critical talent, and compromise the integrity of transgender troops who would be forced to live a lie, as well as non-transgender peers who is forced to choose between reporting their comrades or disobeying policy. As a result, they go on to say, the proposed ban would degrade readiness even more than the failed don't ask, don't tell policy did. Other military leaders have spoken out to denounce this ban. Former Joint Chiefs of Staff Mike Mullen, Army Chief of Staff General Mark Milley, Commandant of the United States Coast Guard Carl Schultz, Chief of Naval Operations Admiral John Richardson, Commandant of the Marine Corps General Robert Neller. Yet the president has chosen to ignore the expertise of these military leaders, making clear the president has done that prejudice, not patriotism, drives his decisions. The president's ban, again, is cruel. No one with the strength and bravery to serve in the U.S. military should be turned away because of who they are. The House will continue to fight this discriminatory action, which has no place in our country. We will never allow hate and prejudice to dictate our national security. I hope we have a resounding yes vote to reject the president's ban today. Again, I thank our distinguished chairman, Mr. Smith, our colleague, Joe Kennedy, for his leadership and courage, and yield back the balance of my time.
Members are reminded to refrain from engaging in personalities towards the president. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'll reserve the balance of our time.
I'm sorry, at some point, someone's got to tell me what engaging in personalities means. I've served in this body for a long time. I still don't know what that means. With that, I yield 2 minutes to the gentlelady from California, Ms. Davis.
Gentlewoman is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in solidarity with our transgender service members and to stand against President Trump's proposed ban of transgender people serving in the military. Transgender troops have been serving openly since 2016 at home, overseas, and in combat zones without incident. When I met with transgender service members last month, I was impressed to learn that by serving openly, I want to make a note of that, by serving openly, the quality of their service improved. And in fact, the obstacles, and there are many obstacles, Mr. Speaker, the obstacles they have overcome informed their greater ability to do their job. Their impressive records speak for themselves. And there is no doubt that each of the service members I met with have served their country with distinction. As already stated, this ban is blatant discrimination, poorly disguised as concerns over readiness, unit cohesion, and medical costs associated with transitioning. We already know that there have been 0 reports of issues regarding unit morale or cohesion since the ban was lifted in 2016, a fact that has been supported by the Chief of Staff of every service. The cost of medically transitioning has also been proven to have minimal impact on the military's healthcare budget. This administration is resorting to misinformation to exclude capable, qualified people from service to their country. At a time when the Army is failing to meet recruitment goals and the Navy and Air Force opted to lower their quota in order to reach their own recruitment goals, We cannot be turning away dedicated, able-bodied recruits simply because they happen to be transgender. I yield back my time.
The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I continue to reserve.
Gentleman
Thank you.
from Washington is recognized.
2 minutes to the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Spear.
Gentlewoman is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise today to support this resolution with vigor. Last month, the Subcommittee of Military Personnel within the Armed Services Committee held a hearing. It was the first time in the history of this Congress that 5 transgender members of the military were allowed to testify. 4 of them are trans female, 1 of them is trans male. All 5 of them have served our country with distinction. All 5 of them have served more than 12 years in the military. 1 of them is a West Point graduate. All of them have served either in Iraq, Afghanistan, multiple deployments, and in submarine service. And to the service member, all I saw was pride to be in the military, pride to serve their country, pride to put themselves on the line. The testimony from the administration was like a twisted pretzel. They offered a weak and dithering defense of their cruel policy. 2 things became clear at this hearing. First, the administration policy is a ban. Make no mistake about it. Those who are in the military and serving as transgender can continue to do so. No one can come into the military who is transgender. If you are in the military and transgender and have not identified, you cannot identify. So it is a ban. Captain Alvia Stellick put it best. Currently, soldiers are allowed to seek care no matter what, trans-related or not. If the policy changes, soldiers will no longer be allowed to seek care because if you say, I'm trans, and get a diagnosis of gender dysphoria, regardless of your job performance, you are ineligible and will be terminated. The policy is a solution in search of a problem. Worse, it discriminates against our service members. Second, the hearing demonstrated resoundingly that the last 2.5 years of open service have been unequivocally successful. And with that, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Speaker, let me say transgender service members have been there for us. It's time for us to be there for them.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I continue to reserve.
Gentleman from Washington is recognized.
I yield 1 minute to the distinguished Majority Leader, Mr. Hoyer.
Gentleman from Maryland is recognized for 1 minute. Without objection.
I thank the chairman for yielding. I thank the ranking member for his service and his leadership as chairman. I would urge all members to reject the president's executive order and to support this resolution. Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong support of the resolution introduced by my friend, the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Kennedy. His resolution simply states that millions and millions of Americans know to be true that the Trump administration's ban on transgender people serving their country in our military is discriminatory. It reflects bias. It reflects prejudice. Indeed, it reflects bigotry. Martin Luther King tried to teach us that what we said in the Declaration of Independence, we ought to live out. He said that all of us, and certainly he would have included women, as we did yesterday in our Pay Equality Act, are created equal in the image of God. Martin Luther King said that we ought to judge one another on the content of our character. The president's order does not do that. The president's order is based upon a prejudiced view of somebody because of a distinction that is not the content of their character nor the quality of their performance. I was proud to be the sponsor of and brought to this floor as Majority Leader the repeal of the Don't Ask, Don't Tell legislation. That has enhanced our national security, not diminished it. The president's resolution states what millions and millions of Americans know to be true: that the Trump administration's ban on transgender people serving their country in our military is discriminatory, that it denigrates the service of patriotic Americans. That is the facet of their character. They are patriotic and they want to serve. And the service adjudges them able to do so. And that this resolution, millions of Americans understand, undermines our national defense at a time of serious global threats. And this resolution rightfully calls on the Trump administration not to implement such a ban on April 12th. To do so would be a blow to our country and the principles it represents. Let me remind my colleagues that there was a time when we said African Americans ought not to serve with white Americans together because that would undermine morale and undermine the security of our country. That was a manifestation of prejudice and bigotry, not of intellectual honesty. Content of character. Have we not yet learned that lesson? Are we not big enough to live out the premise of all men and women are created equal? This resolution seeks to redeem the best of America's principles, not the worst of our discriminatory past. I was proud to bring legislation to the floor as Majority Leader that ended Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and it was overwhelmingly supported in this House and in the Senate and passed, and has been a benefit, not a detriment. In the years since, we've seen our military strengthened by the open service of many LGBT Americans who have contributed a great deal to keeping America safe and advancing our national security interests around the world. To say that transgender service members in uniform that they must leave their units, not because they're not performing well, not because they're not needed, but because of who they are. Not the content of their character, not their service, not their performance, but because of who they are. This would be a shameful action for our country and deprive us of their talent and contributions. To deny transgender Americans the opportunity to put on that uniform and wear the flag of the country, as I do every day they wish to serve, would be to diminish that flag, that Declaration of Independence, that Constitution of the United States of which we are so proud. I hope my colleagues in this body will join in sending a clear message that the House, not Republicans, that the House of Representatives, the People's House, reflects the values, the service, and patriotism of our transgender fellow Americans. Let us today reflect the best of our values, not the worst of our values. Pass this resolution. Make America proud of its Declaration of Independence and its Constitution, and of Martin Luther King Jr.'s admonition to make our judgments based upon content of character. And I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I continue to reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Thank you. I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from California, Mr. Carbajal.
Gentleman from California is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As a veteran, I rise in support of this resolution. When this country first debated the possibility of African Americans, women, or LGBT people serving in our military, the same doubts, the same reports, and the same concerns were raised regarding their service. One of these misleading claims is that allowing trans individuals to serve could harm our military readiness. Mr. Speaker, allowing patriotic Americans who are willing, capable, and ready to serve their country does not harm readiness. I'll tell you what does. Diverting military personnel and billions of dollars in military construction funding to build an unnecessary wall to respond to a non-fabricated military emergency. I want to ask my colleagues who support this shameful service ban whether they believe they have the right to deny an individual their right to be who they are, to limit opportunities because of their gender identity. Are these the values America was founded upon? We as a nation are much better than this. During the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, critics invoked fear upon America, saying that it would disrupt unit morale and readiness. Today, 9 years later, we have the most powerful and capable military in the world. For almost 3 years, transgender troops have been able to serve openly. During that time, there has been no evidence of lack of military readiness or unit cohesion. Unfortunately, in return for their service, we are requiring they suppress their identity. This is absolutely unacceptable and discriminatory. I believe former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Dempsey, responded best when he stated, "The service of the men and women who volunteer, who meet our standards of service, is a blessing, not a burden." I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Speaker, I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Please yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Brown.
Gentleman from Maryland is recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to express my vehement opposition to banning service in the armed forces by openly transgender individuals because the Trump administration considers transgender identity to be some medically disqualifying condition. Gender identity is not a medical condition. It's who we are as individuals. Since President Truman desegregated the military, we've torn down barriers to the equal treatment and opportunity of every American to serve. Women now serve in combat roles, defending our nation as Rangers, infantrymen, and submariners. Gay, lesbian, and bisexual Americans serve our country openly and with distinction. In 2016, the Pentagon lifted the ban on transgender Americans, allowing them to serve without having to hide their true identity. The fact that thousands of transgender service members are currently serving, meeting and exceeding standards, are deployed worldwide, speaks volumes about their dedication and contributions to our nation. We need their skills, their experience, their courage, and their patriotism. In 1948, many Americans agreed that racial segregation in the armed forces was right. But history shows all of us today that they were wrong. Former Defense Secretary Gates said, "No aspect of Black Americans' quest for justice and equality under the law has been nobler than what has been called the fight for the right to fight." My 30 years in the Army leads me to believe that all Americans who want to serve, who can meet our standards, should be given the right to fight. My deep belief is shared by General Dunford, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who reiterated that very belief to me just 2 days ago. We have an obligation to allow transgender Americans the right to fight for our nation. We cannot, Mr. Speaker, settle for this discriminatory policy. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
I continue to reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from
Thank you, Mr.
Washington is
Speaker.
recognized.
Please yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from California, Mr. Cisneros.
Gentleman is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank Mr. Kinney for his leadership on this issue and the members and staff of the House Armed Services Committee for help bringing this important resolution to the House floor. I served in the Navy during the time of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. Too many were forced to live their lives in secret, unable to be true to themselves. In 2016, transgender service members were allowed to serve openly in the United States military. Individuals like Lieutenant Commander Blake Drummond, who is still currently on active duty and who has deployed 11 times. During his testimony in the Military Personnel Subcommittee, he stated that his transition meant that he was no longer compartmentalizing parts of his life. He also stated that his decision to transition made him a better officer and a better leader. And he has proven it by receiving the Navy's Batchelder Award, which is given to the Navy's top supply corps officers. My support for Lieutenant Commander Drummond and all transgender service members is unequivocal. They have sworn tremendous courage, and it's why I fight for inclusion and equality for the LGBTQ community. The President's policy is taking not only our military, but our country backwards. It is unnecessary and is purely discriminatory action against a group of individuals who want to do nothing more than serve their country, and a disgusting attack on a community that he once swore to protect. He is attacking service members who have already proven their ability to meet strategic needs and who pose no risk to unit cohesion or military readiness. As far as I'm concerned, any person who has the courage, spirit, and commitment to serve our country in uniform when so many choose not to should be allowed to do so. I will vote to pass this resolution, and unlike the President, I will continue to advocate for and protect our LGBTQ community. I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to vote in support of this resolution and denounce the President's hateful policy towards our service members. I yield back the balance of my time.
Members are reminded to refrain from engaging in personalities toward the President. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Speaker, I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Nadler.
Gentleman from New York is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong support of this resolution and in opposition to the administration's ban on openly transgender individuals in the armed services. Throughout history, each time we expand who may join the armed services to better reflect the diversity of our nation, the same tired and disproven arguments are brought back. That any individual within the new group, regardless of their abilities, is unfit to serve, and that they will disrupt unit cohesion. We heard these arguments with respect to Black and Latino men, women, and gays, lesbians, and bisexuals. But we know that is simply untrue. There are no issues with transgender individuals serving in the military. You don't have to take my word for it. The service chiefs of all 5 branches of our military have testified that there have been 0 instances of transgender service members hurting cohesion or readiness since the ban was first lifted. The obsession, the conservative obsession with targeting and attacking transgender individuals in all areas of American life is cruel and immoral. It is astonishing that after years of support our troops' demagoguery from my colleagues across the aisle, they would choose to turn their backs on active duty service members and vote to specifically deny them medically prescribed care. After 2.5 years of transgender service members serving with no issues, there is one reason and one reason alone for this administration to be bringing back a ban on transgender service members: to force a bigoted agenda on the military that they cannot force on the rest of the American people. Mr. Speaker, much of the history of this country
is the history of expanding our understanding of who the Declaration of Independence meant when it said that all men are created equal. It didn't mean in 1776 black men. It certainly didn't mean women. It didn't mean Native Americans. It didn't mean LGBTQ people. We've come to the point where we understand, at least aspirationally, it means all of those things. This resolution gives us a choice. Do we join the march? Do we continue the march to expand the meaning of the Declaration of Independence, to declare equality for everyone, regardless of specific characteristics? Or do we join that dreary procession of slavers and Confederates and racists and misogynists who have dragged this country through the mud and have besmirched the ideals of the Declaration of Independence? That's our choice today. Let's take the right one. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Speaker, I continue to reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Cicilline.
Gentleman from Rhode Island is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in strong support of this resolution expressing opposition to President Trump's decision to ban transgender individuals from serving the armed forces. I'm proud to be a co-sponsor of this resolution. I thank my friend, Mr. Kennedy, for his extraordinary leadership on this issue. The president's decision in 2017 to prohibit transgender individuals from military service is disgraceful and wrong. Not only is it a decision based on ignorance and bigotry, but the evidence shows that there is absolutely no need for this discriminatory policy. America has the strongest and most effective military in the history of the world. And that's because of the brave individuals who serve in uniform. Excluding an entire group of highly qualified and skilled individuals from service undermines our national security. In 2016, the Obama administration removed the ban on transgender individuals after thoroughly and carefully studying how it would impact the military and military readiness. A year later, President Trump announced he would resume prohibiting transgender individuals from serving in a tweet and didn't even bother to tell his Secretary of Defense about it. The National Center for Transgender Equality estimates that over 15,000 trans people are currently serving in the military. And in 2016, a study by the Rand Corporation found that service by transgender individuals does not adversely affect readiness. And in fact, many military leaders have acknowledged that the ban will degrade military readiness. This cruel ban seeks to force transgender members of our military back into the closet or out of service. It's a policy that's not based on any fact or any careful deliberation, but merely an attempt to score points with the hard right faction of his political base. By doing this, the president is hurting our military, making our country less safe, and making our country less just. Transgender individuals who serve our country in the armed forces are American heroes. They deserve our thanks, and they deserve more than to be used as a political prop by their commander-in-chief. We as a country are better than this. Mr. Speaker, quite simply, it is un-American and immoral to deny transgender individuals who want to serve our country in uniform the right to do so simply because of who they are. I urge my colleagues to support this resolution, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
I continue to reserve, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman, members are reminded to refrain from engaging in personalities towards the president. The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Lee.
Gentlewoman from California is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Smith, for your leadership and for yielding time. And I also want to recognize Congressman Kennedy for his tremendous leadership on this issue. Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong support of HRES 124, rejecting the president's discriminatory ban on openly transgender service members in the military. Transgender service members have served with honor and distinction in the defense of our country for decades. Yet President Trump announced on Twitter that transgender service members would no longer be allowed to serve, despite the fact that many military leaders concluded that being transgender does not impact our readiness. President Trump's own chief of staff said he hadn't received any reports of problems with unit cohesion or morale regarding transgender service members. The president's cowardly ban makes it clear that prejudice and patriotism guides his decisions. As the daughter of a career military officer who served in a segregated military, I know what it's like for our country to betray our American values. As a person of faith, I was taught to treat everyone equally. As an African-American woman, I will fight discrimination wherever it surfaces. I urge my colleagues to vote yes on this resolution.
Members are reminded to refrain from engaging in personalities toward the president. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Speaker, I continue to reserve.
The gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to yield 1 minute to the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee.
The gentlewoman from Texas is recognized for 1 minute.
I thank the chairman, and I thank the ranking member managing this bill, and I thank Mr. Kennedy for his insight. We're reminded that we have nothing to fear but fear itself. Franklin Delano Roosevelt offered those great words on the precipice of World War II, the victory that the United States troops standing side by side, and some of them African Americans who lived and served in the uniform, but in a segregated way. But their blood was the same. They shared their blood in the same way. They died in the same way. Do we want victory or defeat? Let me be very clear. Allowing transgender to serve and rushing them out is a travesty. Do you realize that it is clear that the RAND report found that health care coverage for transgender military personnel would increase the U.S. military total account by less than zero? In addition, when all of this was banned, we recognized by the Obama administration that we recognize it is honored the sacrifices of selfless transgender service members who have endured exclusion, silence, and persecution due to discriminatory policies and attitudes against LGBT and military personnel, such as Don't Ask, Don't Tell, which was rightfully struck down under the Obama administration. We must be against these disruptive practices. Do we want victory or defeat? There's nothing to fear but fear itself. Support this resolution to stand with those who want to serve and die for their country. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, may I inquire of the chair whether the gentleman from Washington, the chairman, has any further speakers other than himself?
I am prepared to close at this time.
Then, Mr. Speaker, I yield myself the balance of the time.
Gentleman yields back. His gentleman is recognized.
I thank the Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it seems to me that the current House leadership seems rather consumed by presidential tweets. As a matter of fact, just a few moments ago, the Speaker of the House herself was one of those members who had to be reminded that it's a violation of the rules of the House to disparage the character of the president. I guess we could do this every day. The president could tweet and we'd have a sense of Congress to comment on it. And the president would tweet and we'd have, but generally, Mr. Speaker, I think there is a higher and better purpose for this House to work on the problems that confront the American people. This, as I mentioned a few moments ago, this is a messaging bill. It changes no law, it changes no policy. It could also be done down in the radio TV gallery. Somebody could give a speech, there could be a press conference. It would have the same effect as having this resolution on the floor. I cannot have the time to correct all of the misstatements in the resolution or that have been made on the floor today. I will say this, Mr. Speaker, if we're going to do messaging, my primary message is that every individual who serves our nation in the military is entitled to respect and our appreciation, every single individual. And I am among those who was very impressed, by the way, by the transgender individuals who testified in front of our personnel subcommittee just a few weeks ago. But on the substance of this issue, I believe the principle is that the Department of Defense, for the Department of Defense, that any eligible individual who can meet the high standards for military service without special accommodation should be permitted to serve. Any eligible individual who can meet the standard without special accommodation should be permitted to serve. I think that's the standard. That's not exactly what we've been talking about today, but that's the standard. And it should be the standard. There may be some differences about what a special accommodation is, about various medical diagnoses and conditions. I understand that. But the standard is, if you meet the standard without special accommodation, you should be permitted to serve. And those who serve deserve our respect and our appreciation. That's the point, but that's not really the point of this resolution. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself the balance of our time. Let's remember one important point. There was no problem. This was not an issue. It was not talked about until the president decided that, in his words, he wanted to ban transgender people from serving in the military. I hope that's not engaging in personalities. It's simply saying what he said and did. He sent out a tweet saying we should ban people in transgender. And then the military has had to backfill that tweet with a policy. And I feel bad for the members of the military who have had to do that, who have had to waste their time for the last year trying to accommodate the ignorance and bigotry of this presidential policy. There was no problem. Every single service chief testified there's no impact on youth and cohesion. We weren't talking about that until the president decided that he wanted to discriminate against transgender people. And I think the ranking member of the Armed Services Committee is 100% correct. Every eligible person who can perform the duty should be allowed to serve. This policy violates that principle in a whole bunch of different ways, but I will simply mention two. Even if you have already transitioned, even if you have already gone through all of the healthcare needs and have fully transitioned to a new gender, this policy says you will not be allowed to serve if you are transgender. That means that fully qualified people, not ones who have potential future surgery or anything, are being banned from serving. It also says if you're serving now, you cannot be who you are. And this is where the ignorance comes in. This would go, wow, what do you mean? You got to be the gender you were born in. That's not the way it works. That is ignorance talking. And this policy saying that, no, sorry, you got to be in your, quote, biological sex means you have to deny who you are. And that will also ban people from serving who are otherwise 100% qualified. Without question, trans men and women who are fully qualified to serve in the military will be banned by this policy. We've already seen the other two are, well, the healthcare costs will go up. No, they won't. The stats, the evidence, the facts show that transgender people have no greater healthcare costs than the average person serving in the military. And the unit cohesion argument is an absolute joke. This debate, this policy prompted by the president, inserting discrimination where it did not belong, is the only thing that has caused any of this issue. As General Milley said, zero evidence of any unit cohesion issue. So let's be 100% clear here. This policy is based on ignorance and bigotry. And why are we doing it on the House floor instead of down in some press conference somewhere? Because the vote of this House matters more than just the individual words of a few members. I, as a member of the United States House and as a citizen of the United States of America, want my Congress to go on record that we will not stand for ignorance and bigotry in our military or anywhere else. A vote of this House makes it clear just how wrong-headed this policy is. And make no mistake, this is not the military that wanted this. The president drove it, and he is causing problems that do not need to be caused. We should reject this policy.
Has expired.
Thank you. I yield back.
All time for debate has expired pursuant to House Resolution 252. The previous question is ordered on the resolution and the preamble. The question is on adoption of the resolution. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the resolution. The gentleman from Washington.
I request the yeas and nays.
Gentleman requests the yeas and nays. Those favoring a vote by the yeas and nays will rise. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. Pursuant to Clause 9 of Rule 20, this 15-minute vote on adoption of the House Resolution 124 will be followed by 5-minute votes on agreeing to the Speaker's arrival of the journal, and this is a 15-minute vote.
The U.S. House wrapping up their week by taking up a resolution which would oppose banning service in the armed forces by openly transgender individuals. This comes after the Pentagon announced that a directive has been signed to implement President Trump's policy barring some transgender people from serving in the U.S. military. This is final passage, a 15-minute vote. The debate this morning led by the chair, Adam Smith, and the ranking member, Mac Thornberry, of the House Armed Services Committee. The committee earlier this week hearing from Pentagon officials, General Dunford and the acting secretary, Patrick Shanahan, on the 2020 proposals for the Pentagon. We covered that. You can find that at cspan.org. Also,